What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I am broadcasting today from my little man cave here in Bordeaux, France, where I am for a few weeks and then I am moving to Spain. That's why I've been fairly inactive recently. I've just been moving country. I've been to like the Czech Republic, then Italy, then Spain, then back to the Czech Republic, then to Croatia, and then back to the Czech Republic and now moved to Spain, but spending some time in France. So cheers. Guys, straight off the bat, if you like my music, news, reviews, and just music talks, please do hit the subscribe button. It is the most helpful thing that you can do for the channel. Today, we're going to talk about some forgotten albums. And I don't mean albums that just people have forgotten. I'm talking albums which the bands themselves kind of forgot that they wrote and released. They don't really talk about them very much. They don't perform any of the songs from the albums live throughout their set list. And there's a variety of reasons why this might happen. Perhaps the critics didn't like the album. That's reason number one. Usually the album didn't make any money. Sometimes there can be situations where a member of the band actually owns the rights to the songs on that album, and therefore sometimes the band can't perform certain songs from that album because an ex-member won't allow them to. It doesn't happen often, but it can be a thing. So yes, let's get straight into this, guys. I hope you enjoy it, and if there's any that you can think of, any forgotten albums, any albums which the bands just don't seem to care about anymore, any albums which even the fans don't even think about, perhaps underrated albums, drop them down in the comments. Album number 1. Blink-182, Neighborhoods. Now you guys know that I couldn't make a video on albums without making some form of reference to Blink-182, particularly the Neighborhoods album, because this album came out when I was 20 years old and there was so much hype for it at the time. And obviously when you've got that much hype, when you've got a band who have got back together after 4 years, then they've gone ahead and cancelled a massive European tour just so they can focus on this album. Then the first song from that album is released, Up All Night, and the fans have mixed reactions to it. You're not off to a good start. If you've gone to the effort of cancelling a tour, this album's got so much hype, everyone's super excited for it, and the lead single off that album, people are like, it's okay, I guess. That can sometimes be troublesome, but why do no songs from this album get played live anymore, even though the album itself did pretty good overall among fans? There are a lot of fans, in fact, who much prefer this album Neighborhoods to the later two releases, 9 and California, mainly because it's the final album, not including the Dogs Eating Dogs EP, that was released with Tom Delonge. Now, here's the thing. Here's where it gets a little bit complex, because obviously when Blink-182 release new music, they're going to want to play songs off that new release in order to promote it and get more people to buy it. But let's really backtrack here, okay? Let's look at their earlier albums, such as 1997's Dude Ranch. Now let's look at the track listing and the songwriters on Enema of the State, and then Take Off Your Pants and Jacket. Now, if you look at those songs and you break it down song by song, you'll notice that the writing credits between Tom Delonge and Mark Hoppus were extremely equal. They're basically getting their fair share of it. Then became 2003's self-titled album. And if you look at the credits here, you'll notice, it's very different. It's very much a Tom-heavy album. In 2002, Tom Delonge had gone off and created Boxcar Racer, which was basically a creative outlet for him. And I have done a whole separate video on that if you want to go and check it out. But basically, Mark was talking to Tom during this time and they were sharing songwriting ideas, and Mark was digging a lot of the stuff which Tom was producing. And he was saying, hey, why don't we put that on the next Blink album? And as it turned out, that album just kind of gradually snowballed into a very Tom-heavy album. It was extremely clear that there was a change in the overall Blink-182 sound during this period. And the thing which is interesting about this album and Neighborhoods is when this album first came out, again, people were like, I'm not sure how I feel about it. Due to the fact that, again, Neighborhoods was such a Tom-heavy album, the band had come back together, but they're recording the album in separate studios, probably to avoid conflict. There's Tom recording down in San Diego and sending the files to Mark and Travis. They're recording and sending them back. there was not much collaboration, therefore it became a very Tom-heavy album. Obviously, they just got the band back together, they didn't want to piss him off, and so they worked out a system where he could work on his other stuff, but also work on a Blink-182 record and keep it rather flexible. Although I must say that Tom has really, over the last decade or so, just not been as dedicated as Mark and Travis, obviously because he's still no longer in the band. I think there's a bit of a sour taste in their mouth, but also a lot of the songs on there are Tom compositions. They just don't feel right for the overall vibe of a Blink-182 live concert. Album number 2, Headless Cross by Black Sabbath. Now, I'm sure not many of you have heard about this underrated gem from Black Sabbath. Most people tend to remember the classic lineup, and I guess you could say the final lineup, minus drummer Bill Ward, also including Geezer Butler, Ozzy Osbourne, obviously, and Tony Iommi. During the band's reunions, eventually leading to the sort of deceasing farewell tour in 2016-2017, you would be hard-pressed to find within the set lists of these reunion songs and these original lineup live shows any of the music performed with singers like Hughes or Gillen. And that is very, very much true. Obviously, when people go to see Black Sabbath, and especially if it is the original lineup and it is their farewell tour, of course they're going to expect the songs being played to be the songs released with Ozzy Osbourne. But Black Sabbath really have had a revolving door of members, most famously having Ronnie James Dio as their singer, but also then having Tony Martin as their singer. And this guy was around for the best part of a decade. In fact, he is their second longest serving lead singer besides Ozzy Osbourne. Throughout the 1980s, there was a gradual change in the sound of Black Sabbath. They went from being sort of the pioneers of heavy metal and doom metal, and then incorporating a bit more hard rock, a bit more power metal, a bit more upbeat 80s style heavy metal, with even glam rock songs. There are even some songs on this album which you might expect to hear from a band like Kiss or maybe Alice Cooper. Sort of power metal sound blended with hard rock with the original heavy metal Black Sabbath sound. And I think this definitely lends itself to the fact that Tony Martin had such a powerful falsetto voice, perfect for this genre of music. But at the time, it just wasn't that well received among fans. Obviously, they had invested so much into Ozzy Osbourne and then so much into Dio. So what would happen about a year after this album Headless Cross was released? Well, Geezer Butler and Dio would perform a one-off show together, a one-off appearance together, and then Geezer Butler actually ended up convincing Tony Iommi to let both him and Dio back in the band, which is then when they started work on the 1992 Dehumanizer album. Tony Iommi would go on to say, "I do regret that in a lot of ways. We were at a good point then. We decided to reunite with Dio, and I don't even know why really. There's the financial aspect, but that wasn't it. I seem to think maybe we could recapture something we had." Now, Black Sabbath's tenure with Dio is definitely not something that is forgotten about. Not only because Dio went on to form his incredible band Dio, but the Dio era Sabbath albums are some of the fans' favorites. And this really is highlighted by the fact that in 2006, original members Geezer Butler and Tony Iommi, Dio and drummer Tony Appice do some sort of reunion shows, but ended up calling the project Heaven and Hell, named after their 1980 album. And they performed specifically Dio era songs. But honestly, that Tony Martin era is some of my favorite Black Sabbath music ever to be released, mainly because I am a sucker for like 80s metal, glam metal, hard rock, heavy metal, mixed with some fast riffs, bit of double bass, bit of synthesizer as well. The 80s was when Black Sabbath really started including synthesizer in their sound. And during an interview with Loudwire recently, Iommi has mentioned the possibility of creating a remastered box set featuring the Martin era albums. So I think that would be super, super cool. Album number 3, Cardiology by Good Charlotte. Now, I won't say much about this album, but it was their final album that they released before going on a few years hiatus between 2010, 2011 and 2016 when they released the really good album Youth Authority, which I think is actually my favorite Good Charlotte album. But again, if you look through their live set lists, it's highly unlikely you will find any songs from this album played. And I think this is for two reasons. Reason number one, when people go to see Good Charlotte, they go for the nostalgia factor. And this is very, very apparent because I've seen Good Charlotte a handful of times, most recently 2017. And their set list was chock-a-block full of songs from the Young and Hopeless era. Riot Girl, The Anthem, Girls and Boys, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, Wondering, Story of My Old Man. The last time I saw them, they played 2 songs from the Chronicles of Life and Death, 1 song from Youth Authority, and from YouTube footage that I've recovered from any subsequent tours after 2017. They again have just been playing 1 or 2 songs from each album, particularly their latest album, Generation RX, but definitely focusing on that Young and Hopeless era. And why wouldn't you? Good Charlotte are smart. They know that they need fans who are going to engage with them, who are going to be so psyched to watch them at their shows. They know that when people go to see their shows, they want to hear the familiar songs so they can bounce around and go wild and feel more inclined to listen to them on a regular basis. Perhaps go see another show, perhaps buy some of the merchandise, perhaps download their albums, perhaps stream their albums, etc. But particularly the Cardiology album gets left behind. Why is this? Well, there are 2 reasons I can think of. Number one, out of all of their albums, it was the one which just really wasn't received very, very well. It didn't have any bangers on it that I would say, oh, that's such a great song. And it really, really integrated such a heavy pop rock sound. Like they went from sort of pop punk and punk rock to pop rock, and then just straight up on this album, it was just poppy rock. And it's not memorable enough for us to want to hear it. It's not nostalgic enough for the people in their 20s and 30s to want to listen to it at a show. And even though I'm sure that Good Charlotte get plenty of fans every single day through YouTube and streaming and appearances and releasing music, they garner attention from younger audiences. This album just doesn't really appeal to any of those audiences. It's not old enough to be nostalgic, but it's also not young enough to be new and relevant. And therefore it's fallen by the wayside a little bit. Final album, The End of the World Party by Icy Stars. Now, I interviewed Zach from Icy Stars a few months ago, so I won't go into too much detail, but I did ask him why they kept changing their sound with every album. You've got the sort of metalcore-y, pop-punky album from 2009 called 3D. And then in 2011, you have The End of the World Party, which pretty much is straight up pop-punk. It is pop-punk with synthesizers and a bit of breakdowns. But then 2012, 2013 era with Digital Renegade and New Demons, those were so heavy. Those were straight up metalcore albums. They were metal and metalcore albums with EDM mixed in. They were so heavy. So you've gone from sort of metalcore, pop punk, A Day to Remember style music, kind of akin to that standard 2009 era synthesizer metalcore with V-necks. Then you've gone straight up pop punk, but then you've gone back to metalcore, and then a bit more synth heavy and a bit more EDM in recent releases such as Treehouse. And the reason they did this, Zach mentioned, was that they wanted to stay ahead of the curve. And this is a great thing to do, obviously. Bring Me the Horizon are a great band because they've always been ahead of the curve. They've been releasing metalcore before metalcore was cool. They've been doing sort of pop rock metal before that's become a cool thing. Icy Stars were not wrong to do this. By 2011, pop punk was becoming the new thing. It's particularly easycore was extremely popular around this time. Some bands were just getting in the mainstream very, very effectively with metalcore music. Look at Of Mice and Men and Amity Affliction. The thing with those other bands I mentioned though is that it always stayed consistent. Even though they were releasing metalcore album and then a slightly poppier metalcore album and then another rock album with metalcore elements, Icy Stars went sort of like metalcore, straight up to pop punk, back down to metalcore, bit of EDM, just bouncing around all over the place. And because they garnered most of their fan base, most of their current fan base from those later releases anyway, there is just no point playing any songs off 3D or End of the World Party. It wouldn't even match their set list remotely. Maybe a couple of songs from 3D, perhaps What This Means to Me or The Common Hours, but otherwise it just doesn't go hand in hand. And because it was a bit more of an experimental album, of course, it gets left by the wayside. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for joining me today with my rambles on the music industry and albums. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. One more time, drop your thoughts down in the comments section. Hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, and I'll see you soon.